You needn't ask another lady, Mr. Ashford. I will take your hand. The words were spoken softly, yet somehow they silenced the cedar gallery more completely than a shout. Only moments earlier, Emily Carter had been standing beside her aunt beneath the amber glow of the gas chandeliers, watching the autumn gathering unfold inside Alderwyn Hall. Beyond the tall windows, the Northumberland coast had vanished beneath a moonless October sky, and the wind coming from the North Sea pressed against the glass with a low, restless murmur. Inside, everything glittered. Silk gowns swept across polished oak. Crystal glasses caught the light. A quartet played beneath the carved gallery while daughters of wealthy families waited to be invited onto the dance floor. Thomas Ashford stood among them as though he belonged to another world. He was the younger brother of William Ashford, Duke of Alderwyn, yet the titles surrounding his family had never protected him from ridicule. Thomas was tall, fair-skinned, broad-shouldered, and plainly dressed by the standards of the room, with brown hair that refused to remain neatly combed and quiet gray eyes that seemed more comfortable studying the gardens beyond the windows than the people before him. Emily had noticed him attempt to ask Lady Catherine Bell to dance. Catherine smiled apologetically and claimed her ankle troubled her. 5 minutes later, Emily watched her accept another gentleman's invitation without the slightest hesitation. Thomas tried again. Miss Lydia Harcourt hid behind her fan and whispered something to her companion. Both women laughed. Still, Thomas did not retreat. He crossed the room toward Lady Beatrice Lowell, whose beauty had attracted a small court of admirers around her. Lady Beatrice, he began, and the first word caught slightly in his throat. He stopped, drew a careful breath, then tried again. Would you honor me with this dance? Beatrice looked at the hand he had offered. She did not take it. Her companions exchanged knowing glances. Mr. Ashford, she said, smiling with exquisite politeness, surely His Grace does not expect us to entertain his simple brother merely because this is his house. Someone laughed. Then another. It was not loud. That made it crueler. Thomas's hand remained suspended between them for one terrible second. Emily watched his expression, expecting anger or humiliation. What she saw was worse. Recognition. He had expected this. Perhaps he had expected it before he ever crossed the room. Thomas slowly lowered his hand and adjusted the cuff of his coat. Of course, he said. The words came easily now because there was nothing left to ask for. Forgive me. He turned toward the windows. No one followed him. The musicians continued playing, and conversation cautiously returned, as though the room had collectively decided that a man's dignity was an acceptable price for an evening's amusement. Emily felt her fingers tighten around her fan. Emily, Aunt Margaret murmured beside her, sensing the change in her expression. Do not involve yourself. Emily looked toward Thomas. He was almost at the edge of the ballroom. Why? Because people will talk. Emily's gaze moved across the smiling faces surrounding Lady Beatrice. They already are. She closed her fan. Then she walked. One step. Another. The distance across the cedar gallery could not have been more than 40 feet, yet every step seemed to draw another pair of eyes toward her. Thomas reached the doorway. Mr. Ashford. He stopped. When he turned, surprise crossed his face. Emily stood before him and extended her hand. Behind her, the first whispers had already begun. Miss Carter? I believe this dance is still without a partner. Thomas stared at her hand. For a moment he seemed unable to speak. You needn't do this. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only weary kindness, as though he were trying to save her from the humiliation he had just endured. Emily met his eyes. I know. She did not withdraw her hand. The quartet moved into the opening measures of another dance. Thomas looked once toward the room, toward the women who had refused him, and the gentlemen pretending not to watch. Then his gaze returned to Emily. Slowly, carefully, he placed his hand in hers. His palm was warm. His fingers trembled once before becoming still. Emily smiled, not because she pitied him, but because she wanted him to understand that she had made her choice freely. Together they turned toward the dance floor. Neither of them noticed the solitary figure standing in the shadowed upper gallery above the ballroom. William Ashford, Duke of Alderwin, had witnessed his brother's first rejection. He had heard Lady Beatrice's insult. He had watched Thomas lower his hand with the practiced dignity of a man who had been taught too often that silence hurt less than hope. And now the Duke's dark gaze rested upon Emily Carter, the obscure young woman from the cottage beyond the apple orchard who had crossed a room full of people to do what every titled lady there had refused to do. She had taken his brother's hand when there was nothing obvious to gain from taking it. William said nothing. He merely watched as Thomas stepped onto the dance floor, and for the first time that evening, the Duke saw his younger brother smile. The smile lasted only a moment, but William saw it, and that was precisely why he did not move. From the upper gallery, the Duke of Alderwin watched Thomas guide Emily Carter through the measured figures of the dance while whispers traveled beneath the music like cold air beneath a closed door. William knew those whispers. He had heard versions of them since Thomas was 17, when a nervous hesitation in speech had first become entertainment for young men too shallow to recognize restraint, and young women too eager for approval to question cruelty. William had tried to stop it once. Then twice. Then for years. A raised eyebrow from the Duke could silence a dining room. A single sentence could end an invitation, close a social door, or make an ambitious family reconsider its manners. Yet every intervention had purchased Thomas another kind of humiliation. People became courteous when William entered and condescending when he left. They spoke slowly to Thomas, praised ordinary remarks as though they were remarkable achievements, and watched William before deciding whether to laugh. 5 years earlier, after an especially miserable dinner at a neighboring estate, Thomas had finally confronted him in the library at Alderwin Hall. Rain had beaten against the windows that night, and Thomas had stood before the fireplace with both hands clenched behind his back. "Do not rescue me again," he had said. William had thought he misunderstood. "They insulted you. And you made them apologize. They deserve to." Thomas had looked at him then with an exhaustion William had never forgotten. "They apologized to the Duke, William. Not to me." The words had landed more heavily than any accusation. William had spent his life believing protection was love expressed through power. Thomas had forced him to understand that power could become another cage when used carelessly. "What would you have me do?" William had asked. Thomas had been silent for several seconds before answering. "Let me discover who is kind when they are not afraid of you." William had given his word. He had hated keeping it ever since. Tonight had tested that promise more severely than most. When Lady Beatrice Lowell mocked Thomas, William's first instinct had been immediate and fierce, not with violence, but with the cold authority that could have emptied Alderwin Hall of every guest before midnight. Instead, he had remained above the ballroom, one hand resting against the carved cedar railing, remembering Thomas's request. Then Emily crossed the room. Now William watched his brother dance. Thomas was not graceful in the fashionable sense. His movements were careful, almost mathematical, as though he counted each measure before trusting himself to the next. Emily did not compensate for him, or guide him conspicuously. She simply followed the rhythm and allowed him to find it with her. When Thomas missed a step, she did not glance around to see who had noticed. She smiled and continued. Something changed in his posture. His shoulders loosened. His attention stopped wandering toward the watching crowd. By the final turn, he was looking only at Emily. William felt an unfamiliar pressure beneath his ribs. Relief, perhaps. Or fear disguised as hope. "Your Grace?" His steward, Mr. Bennet, approached quietly from behind. "Lady Beatrice's mother wishes to speak with you. Tomorrow. She says the matter is urgent." William's gaze remained below. "It is not." Bennet followed his attention toward the dance floor and understood. "Miss Carter appears to have surprised everyone. Including me." The music ended. Thomas released Emily's hand with a formal bow. She curtsied, and for one dangerous instant William expected the familiar ending. A polite retreat. An embarrassed excuse. A woman returning quickly to safer company. Emily did none of those things. Thomas said something William could not hear. Emily answered. Then she laughed. Not at him. With him. Thomas stared at her, as though he had forgotten such a distinction existed. William turned away from the railing. Bennet. Your Grace? What do we know about Miss Carter? The steward hesitated. Very little. She lives with her aunt in the cottage beyond the western apple orchard. Her father was connected with estate management some years ago. William stopped. Connected how? Bennet's expression changed almost imperceptibly. There was an unpleasant matter before his death. Below them, another dance began. William looked back toward Emily. She had returned to Margaret Carter, unaware that the simple kindness of taking one man's hand had just awakened questions in another. Yet William did not intend to judge her for her father's history, nor would he permit himself to mistake suspicion for wisdom. He wanted only the truth. Because Thomas had asked him long ago for something far harder than protection. He had asked for the freedom to know who would remain kind when the Duke was not standing beside him. William looked across the glittering room and understood that tonight, for the first time in years, he might finally have an answer. By morning, the glitter of Alderwyn Hall had disappeared behind nearly a mile of mist, and Emily Carter was once again simply the daughter of a disgraced estate manager living in a weathered cottage beneath the western apple trees. Applekeeper's cottage was small enough that the kitchen fire warmed nearly every room when the wind was kind, though on colder mornings the salt air from the North Sea found its way through the old window frames and made the curtains tremble. Emily preferred it to the grandeur of the hall. Here, nothing pretended to be more valuable than it was. The oak table carried scratches from 3 generations. Copper pans darkened above the stove. Her father's gardening coat still hung beside the back door because Aunt Margaret had never found the courage to remove it. Emily stood there now, looking at the faded brown cloth while the previous evening returned to her in fragments. Thomas's uncertain hand. The laughter behind the fans. His quiet warning that she did not need to dance with him. And then his smile. You have been staring at that coat for several minutes, Margaret said from the table. Emily turned. Her aunt was pouring tea into 2 mismatched cups. I was thinking. That has caused considerable trouble in this family. Emily almost smiled. Margaret did not. Lady Beatrice's carriage passed the cottage 20 minutes ago. Slowly. Perhaps she admires apple trees. In October? Margaret lifted one eyebrow. Emily sat opposite her. You warned me people would talk. And they will? Margaret softened. I did not say you were wrong. Outside, an apple dropped onto the damp grass with a quiet thud. Emily wrapped both hands around her cup. He looked as though he already knew what she would say. Margaret understood immediately whom she meant. Mr. Ashford has lived beneath his brother's shadow for most of his life. That does not give people permission to humiliate him. Society rarely waits for permission. Emily looked toward the small window. She knew that truth better than Margaret realized. 6 years earlier, men from Alderwyn's estate office had entered this same cottage carrying ledgers and questions. Her father, Samuel Carter, had managed several tenant farms along the western boundary. Money had disappeared from estate accounts. Records bore his authorization. By the time anyone demanded an explanation, Samuel was already ill, his reputation collapsing faster than his strength. He insisted he had taken nothing. Few believed him. After his death, the accusation remained attached to Emily's name like winter mud to the hem of a dress. Families who once welcomed the Carters stopped visiting. An offer of employment at a respectable household disappeared without explanation. Invitations became rare. Smiles became careful. Emily learned that disgrace did not require proof. It required only repetition. Perhaps that was why Thomas's face had unsettled her so deeply. She had recognized the moment when a room decided what a person was. Near noon, Emily carried a basket toward the old orchard to gather the last sound apples before the weather worsened. Mist clung between the trees, silvering the branches. Alderwyn Hall rose beyond them, its great towers barely visible on the hill. She had filled half the basket when she heard footsteps on the wet path. Mr. Bennet appeared between the trees, immaculate despite the mud beneath his boots. Emily straightened. "Miss Carter." "Mr. Bennet." He inclined his head. "His Grace requests your presence at Alderman Hall tomorrow afternoon." Her fingers tightened around the basket handle. "The Duke?" "At 3 o'clock." "May I ask why?" Bennet's expression revealed nothing. "His Grace did not say." Emily looked toward the distant hall. For one brief instant she wondered whether Lady Beatrice had complained. Perhaps William Ashford considered her behavior presumptuous. Perhaps the Duke wished to remind the disgraced manager's daughter that dancing with his brother did not make her welcome in his family. The old humiliation stirred, familiar and cold. "Tell His Grace I will come." Bennet bowed and departed. Emily remained beneath the apple branches after his footsteps faded. Then another sound reached her, a metallic click followed by a muttered word from beyond the stone wall. She followed it, and discovered Thomas kneeling beside an old irrigation valve, his coat folded carefully on the grass. He looked up and froze. "Miss Carter." There was soil on his hands and none of the stiffness he had carried in the ballroom. "Mr. Ashford." His gaze dropped briefly to her basket. "Those northern trees should be harvested first. Frost reaches that slope before the others." Emily glanced toward the rows he indicated. "You know the orchard?" "I know most things that grow at Alderman." The answer came without hesitation. Emily noticed it immediately. No struggling words. No nervous pause. Thomas returned to the valve, adjusted a narrow brass fitting, and water began moving cleanly through the channel beside the wall. Emily stared. "The gardeners said that system had been useless for years." Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth. "The gardeners were wrong." For the first time, she heard quiet amusement in his voice. Emily smiled. Somewhere high beyond the mist, the windows of Alderman Hall caught a brief blade of sunlight. Tomorrow she would stand before the Duke and learn why he had summoned her. But today, beside an old orchard wall, Emily Carter began to suspect that the entire county had been wrong about Thomas Ashford too. Thomas seemed unaware that he had just contradicted nearly every story Emily had ever heard about him. She watched as he turned the brass fitting once more, listening to the water travel beneath the soil through pipes that had been silent for years. There was nothing uncertain in his movements. He worked with the calm precision of a man who understood exactly what each piece was meant to do. "How did you know what was wrong?" Emily asked. Thomas glanced toward the narrow channel. "The pressure was uneven. Everyone kept replacing the valve because the valve was visible. The obstruction was 30 feet farther uphill." Emily looked toward the slope. "You found that by yourself?" A faint smile touched his face. "Water is easier to understand than people." She laughed before she could stop herself. Thomas looked startled, then almost suspicious, as though laughter in his presence had too often carried another meaning. Emily immediately understood. "I was not laughing at you." "I know." The answer was quiet. He lowered his eyes to the wrench in his hand. "I am simply not accustomed to knowing the difference so quickly." The words erased her smile, but not her warmth. She set her basket beside the wall. "Then perhaps you have spent too much time with the wrong people." Thomas looked at her for several seconds. The wind moved through the apple branches overhead, sending a scatter of yellow leaves across the damp path. Here, far from chandeliers and polished floors, his speech carried a steadiness she had not heard the night before. Emily wondered whether he noticed the difference himself. "Mr. Ashford, may I ask you something?" His shoulders tightened slightly. "You may ask." "Why does everyone speak as though you understand less than you do?" The question might have offended another man. Thomas only studied the orchard. "Because silence invites people to write their own explanations." He picked up his coat. "When I was younger, I began stumbling over words whenever too many people watched me. The more they waited, the worse it became. Eventually they stopped waiting." Emily said nothing. Thomas continued, perhaps because she did not rush to fill the quiet. "My brother tried to correct them, That made things worse. If the Duke insists a man is capable, society assumes there must be some reason capability requires defending. That is cruel. It is convenient. He nodded toward the irrigation channel. Plants are less complicated. If an apple tree fails, there is usually a reason. Poor soil. Disease. Too much water. Too little. Trees do not fail because another tree whispered something about them at dinner. Emily smiled again, more gently this time. And that is why you know most things that grow at Alderwyn? Partly. Thomas motioned for her to follow him along the wall. They walked nearly a quarter-mile toward a low glass structure hidden behind yew hedges. Several panes were clouded with age, and ivy had begun claiming one corner. Inside, rows of dormant plants rested beneath pale autumn light. Copper pipes ran beneath stone planting beds, and a complicated arrangement of gauges occupied the far wall. The winter garden, Emily whispered. It has been closed for years. 3 years and 8 months. Thomas crossed to the gauges. The heating system failed. 2 engineers from Newcastle said replacing it would cost more than rebuilding the eastern glasshouse. He opened a narrow panel and adjusted a small mechanism. Somewhere beneath their feet came a low metallic hum. A few moments later, warmth began rising through the stone grates. Emily stared at him. You repaired it. Thomas looked almost embarrassed. Mostly. Why has nobody reopened it? His expression changed. William does not know. Emily blinked. The Duke does not know you repaired his winter garden? I wanted to know whether I could before someone praised me for attempting it. That sentence revealed more than Thomas intended. Emily moved closer to the nearest planting bed, where a single fern had begun uncurling beneath the restored warmth. Then I will not praise the attempt. Thomas glanced at her. She touched one green leaf carefully. I will admire the result. Something softened in his face. For several seconds neither spoke. Rain began tapping lightly against the glass roof, turning the world outside into gray watercolor. Thomas reached toward a small clay pot just as Emily did. Their fingers touched. Both stopped. There was nothing improper in it, nothing more than an accidental meeting of hands above damp soil, yet Thomas became perfectly still. Emily did not pull away as though she had made a mistake. She simply lifted her hand and asked, What grows here? Thomas looked at the pot. White hellebore. His voice caught slightly on the second word. Emily waited. He tried again. It flowers in winter. Then it must be stubborn. Resilient, Thomas corrected softly. Their eyes met. Emily understood that he was no longer speaking only about the flower. Far beyond the misted glass, the clock at Alderwyn Hall struck 2. Emily suddenly remembered tomorrow's summons and felt unease return. Thomas noticed. What is it? Your brother has requested that I meet him tomorrow. Thomas's warmth vanished. William? At 3. He looked toward the distant hall, his jaw tightening. Emily expected reassurance. Instead, Thomas said something that chilled her more than the autumn rain. Then whatever he asks you, Miss Carter, remember that my brother rarely asks a question unless he already knows part of the answer. At 3 o'clock the following afternoon, Emily stood outside the Duke's library with the strange certainty that William Ashford already knew every answer she might give him. Rain darkened the tall windows of Alderwyn Hall, and the North Sea wind moved around the old stone walls with a low, mournful sound. Mr. Bennet opened the library door. Miss Carter, Your Grace. William stood beside the fireplace rather than behind his desk. In daylight he appeared even more imposing than he had from across the ballroom, not because of his height or title, but because stillness seemed to belong to him as naturally as authority. Miss Carter. Your Grace. Bennet withdrew, closing the door. Emily remained near it. William indicated a chair. Please. I would rather stand. One eyebrow lifted. As you wish. He crossed to his desk and picked up a folded paper. You danced with my brother. Emily had prepared herself for questions about her father, her reputation, perhaps even her place in Alderwyn society. The simplicity of the statement unsettled her. Yes. Why? Because he asked several women and they treated his courtesy as something shameful. That explains why you disapproved of them. It does not explain why you took his hand. Emily felt heat rise beneath her collar. Must kindness always require an explanation in this house? William's expression remained unreadable. Where my brother is concerned, yes. Then perhaps that is part of the problem. Silence fell. The clock on the mantel marked 3 slow seconds. William could have ended the conversation with a word. Instead he said, "Explain." Emily drew a careful breath. Everyone watches Mr. Ashford as though they are waiting for him to fail. When he hesitates, they decide what the hesitation means before he can finish speaking. Last night I watched a room full of educated people mistake nervousness for ignorance. I did not wish to join them. William studied her. You formed a generous opinion quickly. No. I formed no opinion at all. I danced with him. Something almost like approval passed through the Duke's eyes and vanished. He placed the paper down. My brother will never inherit Alderwin. Emily stared at him. The remark was so abrupt that for a moment she wondered whether she had heard correctly. William continued. The estate, the principal properties, and the title pass according to arrangements that do not depend upon Thomas marrying. Whatever friendship you imagine with him will not provide the future certain people might expect. There it was. Not accusation. Something colder. A test dressed as information. Emily felt an old humiliation awaken inside her, the same one she had known when neighbors stopped speaking after her father's disgrace. You believe I crossed your ballroom because I thought your brother was wealthy. I said no such thing. You did not need to. William's jaw tightened. Emily stepped closer to the desk. Then perhaps you may finally believe I did not dance with an inheritance. The words hung between them. I danced with a man who had been publicly humiliated while everyone else found reasons to look away. William said nothing. If Thomas Ashford owned nothing beyond the coat he wore last night, Lady Beatrice would still have been cruel. And I would still have taken his hand. William's gaze sharpened at the use of his brother's name, but Emily did not retreat. Is that all, Your Grace? He looked toward the rain-streaked window. Your father once worked for this estate. Emily went still. Yes. Samuel Carter. You know his name. I know the accusation attached to it. Her hands closed at her sides. Then you know what people believed. I know what the records claimed. My father said those records were wrong. William turned back to her. Did you believe him? Until his last breath. No hesitation. No apology. William watched her for a long moment before reaching for the bell. Thank you, Miss Carter. Emily stared at him, almost offended by the sudden dismissal. That is all? For today. Bennet appeared moments later. Emily curtsied stiffly and left without looking back. Only when the door closed did William move. He crossed to a cabinet beside the fireplace, unlocked it, and removed a small wooden box. Inside lay his father's silver pocket watch and several yellow documents bound with black ribbon. He opened the watch first. Beneath the inner cover, almost invisible with age, were 3 engraved initials: William, Thomas, and Samuel. William ran his thumb across the final name, then unfolded the oldest document. Samuel Carter's signature appeared at the bottom. Above it was a set of estate figures that had troubled William for years. The numbers did not prove Samuel innocent. Not yet. But they proved something had been hidden. William looked toward the door through which Emily had departed. She believed he had summoned her to judge whether she deserved his brother. She was wrong. He had wanted to know whether money could make her retreat. It had not. Then he had spoken her father's name. She had not begged. She had not bargained. She had simply defended the dead man with the same quiet certainty with which she had defended Thomas. William closed the watch in his palm. For the first time, the Duke began to wonder whether the two people society had judged most carelessly at Alderwin might be connected by a truth neither of them yet understood. For 3 days after her meeting with William, Emily heard nothing from Alderwin Hall, and she told herself that this silence was a relief. Yet each morning her eyes wandered toward the great towers beyond the apple orchard, and each afternoon she found some unnecessary reason to walk near the western wall. On the fourth day, she discovered Thomas waiting beside the old gate with a wooden box beneath one arm and a ring of tarnished keys in his hand. "I thought you might like to see something," he said. Emily looked at the keys. "Does your brother know?" Thomas hesitated. "That depends upon what you intend to tell him." For the first time since leaving the Duke's library, she laughed. Thomas smiled, and together they followed a narrow path climbing almost half a mile toward the cliffs. The wind carried the clean scent of salt and wet grass, while far below, the North Sea moved beneath a pale November sky. At the end of the path stood a forgotten glasshouse surrounded by stone walls and overgrown ferns. Several panes had turned cloudy, and ivy covered one side almost completely. Thomas unlocked the door. "The glass fern house," he said. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth, cedar shelves, and old iron. Emily removed her gloves and touched the edge of a planting table. "How long has this been abandoned?" 12 years. "And you still have the key?" Thomas set down his wooden box. "I have every key William thinks has been lost." Emily looked at him. His expression remained perfectly serious until one corner of his mouth lifted. She laughed again. He began opening the shutters, allowing thin bands of daylight to cross the stone floor. "My mother loved this place," he said. "She grew ferns from America here. Maidenhair, cinnamon fern, Christmas fern. She said winter gardens should contain something green enough to make people remember that cold season's end." His voice changed slightly on the word mother. Emily did not interrupt. Thomas opened his box and removed several brass fittings, a small wrench, and a coil of copper wire. "After she died, I came here whenever the hall became too crowded." "Because it was quiet?" "Because no one waited for me to speak." Emily understood. He knelt beside an old heating pipe. "When people wait for a man to stumble over a word, he begins hearing their expectation before he hears his own thoughts." Emily lowered herself onto the stone ledge opposite him. "Does it happen when you are alone?" "Never." "With your brother?" "Sometimes." He glanced at her. "With you less often." The simplicity of the admission made her heart tighten. Thomas returned to the pipe. Emily watched his hands work, steady and capable, fitting pieces together with an ease that seemed entirely different from the careful man society believed it knew. "Why do you hide this?" she asked. "Hide what?" "Everything you can do." Thomas was quiet. "I stopped showing people things when I realized they praised me differently." Emily frowned. "Differently?" "If William repaired this pipe, they would call him clever. If I repaired it, they would call it wonderful that I managed." Emily felt anger rise, but Thomas only tightened the fitting. "Pity can sound remarkably like kindness when spoken politely." She looked away toward the misted glass. "Yes," she said softly. Thomas stopped working. He had never heard that particular weariness in her voice. "Your father?" Emily nodded. "After the accusation, people brought food to our cottage. They lowered their voices around me. They told me how unfortunate everything was. Then they stopped inviting me into their homes." Thomas sat beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. "Did he take the money?" "No," she answered immediately. "I cannot prove it." "But no." Thomas did not ask for evidence. He simply said, "Then I believe you." Emily turned toward him. "You do not know me well enough. Neither did the people who condemned him." The words entered the quiet like sunlight through old glass. Emily looked down and realized their hands rested only inches apart on the stone ledge. Thomas noticed too. Neither moved. Outside, rain began softly, thousands of small drops whispering across the roof. "This is the only place at Alderwyn where I never feel watched," Thomas said. Emily looked at him. "Then perhaps we should repair it." His gray eyes warmed. "We? Unless you intend to restore 12 years of neglect alone." He offered her a small brass fitting. Their fingers touched as she accepted it, and this time the contact was neither accidental nor hurried away from. Thomas breathed in slowly. Emily. It was the first time he had used her given name. She waited. No pressure. No expectation. I am glad you came. So am I, Thomas. Neither of them saw the distant figure on the cliff path outside. William had come searching for his brother with Samuel Carter's old estate records beneath his coat. He stopped when he saw two silhouettes through the rain-covered glass, sitting quietly side by side. For once, the Duke did not enter. He turned back toward Alderwyn Hall, carrying a secret that was growing heavier with every step. By the following Sunday, the story had changed. It no longer mattered that Emily Carter had crossed the Cedar Gallery because she could not bear to watch another person humiliated. It no longer mattered that Thomas had never promised her money, position, or even affection. By the time the church bells sounded across the wet Northumberland hills, society had created a more entertaining explanation. Emily had known. Lady Beatrice Lowell delivered the rumor with such polished certainty that even those who doubted her repeated it before luncheon. Thomas Ashford, she claimed, was about to receive a substantial portion of Alderwyn property from his brother, and Samuel Carter's disgraced daughter had somehow discovered the arrangement before anyone else. Her kindness at the ball had not been kindness at all. It had been calculation. Emily first heard the rumor outside the village church. Two women fell silent as she approached, but not before she caught the words fortune and desperate girl. Margaret heard them too. Keep walking, her aunt whispered. Emily lifted her chin. She had learned years ago that dignity sometimes consisted of refusing to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Yet this time the accusation hurt differently. She could endure strangers questioning her character. What frightened her was the thought of Thomas hearing them. He did before sunset. A gentleman leaving Alderwyn Hall made a careless remark near the stable yard, asking Thomas whether he intended to reward Miss Carter for discovering his hidden fortune so efficiently. Thomas said nothing. That silence followed him for the rest of the evening. He knew Lady Beatrice could be cruel. He knew gossip could turn coincidence into evidence. He knew Emily had never once asked what he owned. But another memory rose beside those truths, Emily being summoned privately by William. William telling her something Thomas had not been permitted to hear. The old fear returned, quiet and poisonous. Not that Emily was dishonest. That would have been easier. He feared that he had mistaken pity for affection again. The next morning Emily walked to the glass-fern house carrying fresh cloth for cleaning the remaining panes. Thomas was already there. The warmth she expected upon seeing him disappeared when he did not smile. Thomas? He kept his attention on a copper pipe. You spoke with William. Several days ago. About me? Emily set the cloth down. Partly. His hands became still. Did he tell you about my future? She remembered William's cold statement that Thomas would never inherit Alderwyn. He told me what I would not receive by knowing you. Thomas finally looked at her. And what exactly was that? The question wounded her more than its words should have. Is that truly what you wished to ask me? He struggled for an answer. The hesitation returned, not because he lacked one, but because too many fears were competing to become speech. People are saying you knew something before the dance. People said my father was a thief. Emily's voice remained quiet. Repetition did not make that true either. Emily, I only need to understand. Then ask whether I lied to you. Thomas swallowed. Did you? She stared at him. There it was. The smallest question, carrying the greatest injury. No. Thomas looked down. He wanted to believe her. She could see that. But wanting was not the same as choosing. Emily slowly removed the old iron key to the glass-fern house from the ribbon inside her coat. She placed it on the stone table between them. Thomas's face changed. What are you doing? Returning something that belongs to you. You do not have to leave. You believed strangers long enough to ask whether I deceived you. That is not what I meant. Perhaps not. But it is what you asked? Rain moved across the glass roof, soft and relentless. Thomas stepped forward, then stopped himself. Emily! She looked at him, and the sadness in her eyes was worse than anger. I took your hand when an entire room had already decided what kind of man you were. I did not ask them whether you deserved it. Thomas had no answer. Emily turned toward the door. I think I should return home. He wanted to call her back. The words would not come. By the time he found them, the door had closed and her figure was disappearing down the cliff path. On the stone table, the key lay beside the white hellebore they had planted together. That afternoon Emily began packing her small trunk. Margaret found her folding dresses in silence. Where will you go? My cousin in Maine wrote last spring. She said there may be work teaching at a small school near Portland. Margaret stared at her. Across the Atlantic? Emily folded another dress. There is very little keeping me here. At Alderwin Hall, Thomas sat alone inside the restored winter garden until darkness covered the estate. William found him there. You heard the rumor, the Duke said. Thomas did not look up. I asked her if she lied. William's expression hardened. And? She said no. Then why is she packing? Thomas raised his head sharply. William placed a folded railway timetable on the table. Because while you were deciding whether the world might be right about her, she decided she would rather cross an ocean than spend another day proving she is not what people say. Thomas went pale. William turned toward the door, then stopped. There is something else you should know. From inside his coat, he removed Samuel Carter's old records and laid them beside the timetable. The rumor about Emily is false. His gaze settled on his brother. But the secret beneath it is real. And tomorrow, before she leaves Alderwin, I intend to tell her what our father tried very hard to bury. William arrived at Applekeeper's cottage shortly after 9 the next morning, carrying no umbrella despite the fine rain drifting through the orchard. Emily saw him from the kitchen window and felt her stomach tighten. Her trunk stood closed beside the stairs, containing everything she intended to take when she left Northumberland 2 days later. Margaret opened the door before the Duke could knock twice. Your Grace. William removed his hat. Mrs. Carter. I need to speak with your niece. Emily stepped into the doorway. Then speak. William's eyes moved briefly toward the trunk. Something in his expression hardened with regret. Privately, if you please. Margaret looked at Emily, received a small nod, and withdrew. William entered the kitchen, seeming strangely out of place among copper pans, drying herbs, and the old oak table where Samuel Carter had once kept his accounts. He placed a packet of papers upon that table. Your father did not steal from Alderwin. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. William did not soften the statement. He did not decorate it with sympathy. I reviewed the original ledgers against records kept separately by my father. Payments attributed to Samuel Carter continued for nearly 4 months after your father had become too ill to authorize them. Several signatures were copied. Others were transferred from legitimate documents. Emily stared at the packet. Who? Edmund Vale. The former senior steward. The name was familiar. A courteous man with silver spectacles who had once brought broth to her father while telling neighbors how tragic the situation had become. Emily lowered herself slowly into a chair. He visited us. I know. William's voice grew quieter. He also controlled which records reached my father. Emily touched the ribbon around the papers but did not untie it. For 6 years she had imagined this moment. In those imaginings she had wept, shouted, demanded apologies from every person who had turned away. Now there was only stillness. Did your father know? William looked toward Samuel's coat hanging beside the door. Not at first. I believe he discovered inconsistencies later. These papers were hidden among his private documents. He died before correcting what had been done. Emily swallowed. So my father died with everyone believing him guilty because powerful men were too late to admit they were wrong. William accepted the accusation without defense. Yes. He placed another envelope beside the records. This contains compensation from the estate. Lost wages, damages to your father's name, and interest. It is not charity. It is owed. Emily opened the envelope enough to see the figure. The amount could purchase a comfortable home, secure Margaret's future, and make Emily independent for years. She closed it. I will take the records. William's gaze sharpened. And the compensation? No. Miss Carter, the money belongs to you. Then I choose not to accept it. Why? Emily stood. Because yesterday people said I came near Thomas for money. If I leave Alderwyn carrying a fortune from his brother, the truth will become another story no one wishes to hear. You would surrender financial security because of gossip? No. I would surrender it because I need to know that when I leave, I have taken nothing from this family except my father's name back. William studied her for a long time. And Thomas? The question struck deeper than the others. Emily looked toward the rain beyond the window. Thomas deserves someone he can trust. He does trust you. Not when it mattered. William's expression shifted. Fear makes men foolish. Yes. Emily's voice softened. But loving someone does not give me the right to demand that he overcome every fear simply because it hurts me. It was the first time she had allowed the word loving to exist aloud. William heard it. So did she. Emily closed her eyes briefly. If Thomas cannot trust me without his brother proving my innocence, then staying would teach him nothing. And it would teach me to accept too little. William looked down at the untouched envelope. In that instant, the last of his suspicion disappeared. He had watched women flatter Thomas because of the Ashford name. He had watched others avoid him because kindness offered no social advantage. Emily had done neither. She had taken Thomas's hand when doing so cost her standing. Now she was walking away when staying could make her wealthy. William picked up the envelope. There is a gathering tomorrow night. Founders' Night. Every family who matters in this county will be present. I am leaving the following morning. Then attend. Emily shook her head. I have no desire to become their entertainment again. You will not. Something in the Duke's voice changed. Not anger. Decision. Your father's name was damaged publicly. It will be restored publicly. Emily looked at him. And Thomas? William glanced toward the orchard, where the bare branches moved beneath the rain. My brother has spent years asking me not to fight his battles. He put on his hat. Tomorrow night, I intend to discover whether he is finally ready to fight his own. After William left, Emily remained beside the table with Samuel Carter's records pressed beneath her fingertips. Nearly half a mile away, inside the glass fern house, Thomas stood before the key she had returned. He picked it up, closed his hand around the cold iron, and understood at last that if Emily walked away, the greatest loss would not be that she had stopped believing in him. It would be that, when given the choice, he had failed to believe in her. Founders' Night returned light to every window of Alderwyn Hall, but Emily Carter entered the cedar gallery feeling as though she were walking into a room that had already written her farewell. Tomorrow morning, a carriage would take her south to the railway station. From there she would begin the long journey toward Liverpool and, eventually, America. Tonight she wore the same dark blue gown she had worn before her father's disgrace emptied invitations from their cottage. Margaret had carefully repaired the cuffs that afternoon. Emily wanted nothing borrowed from Alderwyn, nothing that could be mistaken for favor. Conversation softened when she entered. Lady Beatrice Lowell stood near the fireplace surrounded by familiar faces, her expression briefly sharpening before becoming pleasantly blank. Emily heard no direct insult. She did not need one. William Ashford had arranged the gathering with unusual formality. The county's principal families stood beneath the cedar beams while estate tenants, senior servants, and several village officials occupied the adjoining hall. Thomas was nowhere in sight. Emily told herself she was grateful. Then the Duke stepped forward. Before we observe the traditions of Founders' Night, there is an obligation this house has neglected for 6 years. The room quieted. William held several documents tied with black ribbon. Samuel Carter served the Alderwyn estate faithfully. After discrepancies appeared in estate accounts, Evidence was presented suggesting that he had misappropriated funds. Emily felt Margaret's hand close around hers. William continued. That evidence was false. A murmur moved through the gallery. Lady Beatrice's smile disappeared. The original records established that payments attributed to Mr. Carter continued after illness had made his participation impossible. Signatures were copied. Accounts were altered. Responsibility belonged to Edmund Vale, formerly senior steward of this estate. William's voice remained calm, making every word more powerful. Samuel Carter was innocent. Alderwin failed him by discovering the truth too late. Tonight, before those whose judgment helped preserve that injustice, I restore his name publicly. Emily lowered her eyes. She had imagined vindication as triumph. Instead, it felt like a locked room opening after years without air. Margaret was crying silently beside her. William looked toward Emily. Miss Carter was offered compensation from the estate. Several faces turned toward her. She refused it. The silence deepened. She accepted only the evidence clearing her father. Lady Beatrice shifted uncomfortably. William's gaze swept across the room. Therefore, any suggestion that Miss Carter sought financial advantage through association with my family is not merely insulting. It is demonstrably false. Emily thought it was finished. Then William placed the Carter records aside and lifted another ledger. There is another misunderstanding that has survived too long beneath this roof. At that moment, the doors opened. Thomas entered. He wore a simple black evening coat, but there was something different in the way he carried himself. His shoulders were straight. His face was pale. He looked first at William, then at Emily. William continued. For 8 years, improvements across Alderwin's western farms have increased yields, restored neglected orchards, reduced winter losses, and repaired irrigation systems once considered beyond recovery. Those plans were not mine. People exchanged puzzled glances. They belonged to Thomas Ashford. Emily felt her breath catch. William opened the ledger. The drainage channels near Belmore. His design. The orchard restoration. His work. The heating system now operating in the western winter garden. His repair. Thomas stared at his brother. William closed the book. My brother has never lacked understanding. He has merely lacked a society patient enough to hear him finish speaking. No one laughed now. Lady Beatrice lowered her fan. William looked toward Thomas, and for once there was no protection in his expression. Only invitation. The rest is yours. Thomas froze. Emily saw the old fear return as every face turned toward him. His lips parted. Nothing came. A few seconds passed. Then his gaze found Emily. She did not smile encouragingly. She did not nod. She simply waited. The same way she had waited in the orchard. The same way she had waited inside the glass fern house. Thomas drew one slow breath. There is one thing my brother has not explained. The first words trembled. The next did not. Miss Carter did not know any of this when she danced with me. He walked toward Emily. She did not know what land I managed. She did not know what money I possessed. She did not even know whether I could finish a sentence without stumbling over it. A faint ripple of discomfort moved through the guests. Thomas stopped several feet from her. She knew only that people had laughed. His voice caught. He waited. Nobody interrupted. And she chose kindness when kindness offered her nothing. Emily's eyes filled, but she held his gaze. Thomas turned toward Lady Beatrice. You called me simple. Beatrice went pale. Thomas did not sound angry. Perhaps I am. I prefer gardens to ballrooms. I understand pipes better than gossip. I sometimes need longer than other men to say what I mean. He looked back at Emily. But I was foolish in only one way that matters. When people questioned her character, I listened to them before I listened to her. He crossed the remaining distance. Emily, I cannot undo that. She whispered. No. Thomas nodded, accepting the answer. But I can refuse to hide behind my brother while I admit it. William stood perfectly still near the fireplace. Thomas offered Emily his hand, but this time he did not ask her to take it. "I am sorry." The entire cedar gallery waited. Emily looked at the hand before her, then at the man offering it. For the first time, Thomas was not asking to be rescued from humiliation. He was standing inside it willingly, speaking for himself. Emily slowly placed her hand in his. And somewhere behind them, the Duke of Alderwin lowered his eyes, because his brother no longer needed him to watch.